The future of U.S. troops in Iraq, meanwhile, is in question this morning. The Iraqi Prime Minister has asked Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to start the process of withdrawal now.
Now, the State Department dismissed the request, saying troops are crucial for the fight against ISIS. U.S. troops are stationed at the Al-Assad Air Base, and that was hit with more than a dozen ballistic missiles. The missiles hit areas of the base that were not occupied by troops, however.
CNN senior international correspondent Arwa Damon is the first journalist to gain access to that air base. She's here now with her exclusive reporting.
These used to be living quarters. This is where the troops would sleep, at least one of the areas. There is almost nothing left, nothing that was salvageable, we were told. The crater itself impacted over here, and it was one of 10 impacts that happened. Being here, it's truly extraordinary how anyone managed to survive, that there were no casualties when you look at the destruction, and then hearing all of the stories of the close calls, of the heroics. What we are now learning is that there was advance warning to a certain degree. They knew something was going to happen, they just didn't know what. And about 11 p.m. at night, those that were able to go to the bunkers went to the bunkers, but there were still troops that were out manning posts that, because of the security situation, they had to stay at. So people were beginning to take shelter at around 11 p.m. and then at 1:34, that's when the first impact happened. A lot of those who we are talking to are saying that it was unlike anything they had ever imagined. Of course, on the one hand, the training does kick in, but at the end of the day, this is a terrifying experience, a terrifying situation.
Our thanks to Arwa Damon there. Joining us now is Richard Johnson. He's the former deputy lead coordinator for the Iran nuclear deal implementation at the State Department. Richard, good morning to you.
Good morning. Thank you. So
let's start here. We've got EU Foreign Minister and the NATO Secretary General met Friday to try to resuscitate the deal. We know that the French Foreign Minister, Le Drian, said that the deal, quote, is not dead. Is it?
I would agree with the French Foreign Minister. The statement that Foreign Minister Javad Zarif of Iran put out the day that they announced that they were going to take another step away from the nuclear deal was very clear that they were staying in the deal. And the key point here is that Iran is continuing to allow the IAEA, the international inspectors, to remain on site to monitor and verify Iran's nuclear program. This is key because that will allow the international community to still know what Iran is up to. There's been headlines, some very misleading headlines, I would say, in newspapers saying that Iran is now racing to a nuclear weapon. But we know because of the international inspections, which were a key part of that Iran nuclear deal, that that is not the case, at least not yet.
Well, a part of the deal was the easing of sanctions. We saw what came from the White House yesterday from Secretaries Mnuchin and Pompeo. What's the virtue of a deal if the sanctions are back?
That's exactly the question that the Iranian government is asking. They stayed in the deal and didn't make any changes for 1 year, even though all of the sanctions that were lifted under the Obama administration were reimposed by President Trump. And that's why they've started to step away starting about in May of 2019. The Europeans are in a really tough spot here. They want to implement this deal. They see it as a huge victory for European diplomacy. But because the Trump administration has essentially said, make a choice, either do business with Iran or do business with the United States, they've had to stick with the United States, which means that Iran is not getting the economic benefits it expected to get as a trade-off for restricting its nuclear program in the deal.
Richard, let's talk about strategy and the way forward. As I mentioned, announcement of new sanctions against Iran came from the White House yesterday. I want you here to listen to now former Secretary of State John Kerry. This is back in 2015. He's talking here about the virtue of sanctions and their role in reaching the JCPOA. Let's watch.
You're not going to sanction them into oblivion. They've proven that. We've seen that in the last years. Sanctions brought them to the table to negotiate. They did the very thing everybody put the sanctions in place to get them to do, which is negotiate. So they negotiated.
Sanctions brought them to the table to negotiate. President Trump seems to think that it can happen again. Can it?
The difference between what President Obama did and what President Trump did is that President Obama built an international coalition to implement those sanctions. And there were UN multilateral sanctions, and there were also sanctions from the European Union. Allies are key here to get any progress on restricting Iran's nuclear program. Unfortunately, by leaving the Iran nuclear deal, the president basically very much frustrated the Europeans by throwing out what had been a great accomplishment. So I don't know how you can get back to the deal just with this so-called maximum pressure. The Iranians have said that they will have maximum resistance, and that's basically what we're seeing here. Again, the good news here is that Iran has not actually moved forward very far in moving back towards the huge, much larger stockpile of uranium that it had prior to the deal. So it's a bit of a zombie deal at this point. It's not dead yet, but I don't think that imposing additional sanctions is going to make that much of an impact at this point.
Listen to President Trump. This is on Thursday.
Then Iran went on a terror spree, funded by the money from the deal, and created hell in Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, Afghanistan, and Iraq. The missiles fired last night at us and our allies were paid for with the funds made available by the last administration.
The administration hasn't put anything forward to prove that. They haven't even tried to justify that statement that's been made. But let me ask you this. In 2015, Senate Democrats proposed a bill that would, among other things, have tracked the money, the resources returned to Iran, and determine if they were used to fund the Quds Force, Hamas, Hezbollah, Assad in Syria. It went nowhere. Was that a mistake not to put more emphasis or to support some type of check biannually to determine where the money went?
Well, I think congressional oversight is always a good thing. So if that could be put back into place, I think that would be welcome. But the reality is this. The U.S. intelligence community monitors this very closely. And even after the nuclear deal came into effect, the Obama administration was very clear. The vast majority of those funds, and by the way, it was a lot less than what President Trump says, went to domestic infrastructure projects and paying off debt in Iran. Of course, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has its own set-aside funds. They're going to draw on those. So we don't know exactly where all the funds went, but I would suspect that most of the funds did not go as was described by the president.
Richard Johnson, good to have your insight, sir.
Thank you so much for having me.
Certainly.